The doors of the royal council chamber opened, and the monarchy was changed forever. By direct order of the council,
the great doors of the Aldemarian council chamber swung open at 9 in the morning, and by the time they closed again, the balance of power inside the royal house of Aldemar had shifted for good. By order of the sovereign council, the title of Queen Consort was stripped from Isolde, wife of King Edmund II, and passed directly to Rosalind, Princess of Vale, wife of the Crown Prince. As the final clause was read into the record, Isolde reached for the back of a nearby chair, missed it, and collapsed in front of the very counselors who had just voted to remove her authority. Isolde had spent nearly 3 decades building her place inside the palace. In the space of a single morning, that place was gone. To understand how the monarchy of Aldemar arrived at this moment, and what it means now for King Edmund, for his son, and for the woman who never asked to inherit any of it, it helps to go back to what was happening behind those chamber doors before anyone outside the palace walls knew a vote was even being considered. Rosalind spent that entire morning in a private sitting room on the far side of Larkhaven Palace, deliberately excluded from every stage of the council's deliberations. The decision to keep her away was not an oversight. It was a safeguard, intended to protect the eventual transfer of title from any accusation that Rosalind herself had lobbied for Isolde's removal. That same safeguard, however, left her completely unprepared for the sealed folder her husband, Crown Prince Alaric, carried into the room roughly 20 minutes after his stepmother collapsed in the chamber below. Alaric did not sit. He placed the council's sealed envelope on the table in front of her without a word. The royal crest of Aldemar embossed above Rosalind's formal name and title. She broke the seal herself and read a ruling that, she quickly realized, had already taken legal effect before she'd even opened it. The first page stripped Isolde of her ceremonial precedence. Beneath that, a second clause transferred Isolde's senior responsibilities, her household staff, her briefings, and her authority over investitures and state receptions, directly to Rosalind. The final paragraph made it official. The title of Queen Consort now belonged to her. Rosalind's first reaction was not triumph. It was something closer to disbelief, followed almost immediately by a single question for her husband. Had Isolde agreed to this? Alaric explained that his father, King Edmund, had offered Isolde a voluntary withdrawal the evening before, a private arrangement that would have let her step back from her duties with her dignity, her patronages, and a reduced but visible public role intact. Isolde had rejected it. That rejection was what forced the council's hand and produced the binding vote Rosalind was now holding in her lap. Tucked inside Alaric's folder were the torn remains of that rejected settlement. For Rosalind, seeing those torn pages erased any illusion that this had been planned as a graceful, mutually agreed transition. Nothing about the morning had been ceremonial. One woman had refused her last dignified exit, collapsed the moment the ruling was read, and left another woman holding a title and a set of responsibilities she had never once asked for. Rosalind set the pages down carefully, as though handling them roughly might make the whole situation feel more real than it already did. Alaric then explained why the council had acted without consulting her at all. It hadn't been about popularity, and it hadn't been a matter of family preference. The council had evidence, gathered over several weeks, that Isolde had altered written instructions personally approved by King Edmund, delayed briefings intended for Rosalind's household, and issued conflicting directions to palace staff after the king's original orders had already left his office. The question that remained was simple. Which instruction, exactly, had exposed the interference in the first place? The answer went back 3 weeks to an investiture rehearsal at Larkhaven that Isolde still believed she controlled. The state apartments at Larkhaven had been prepared for an investiture involving several military officers, a handful of visiting diplomats, and members of the extended royal family. King Edmund, who had scaled back his public schedule that season for health reasons, had approved a formal ceremonial role for Rosalind. His written instruction placed her at the front of the receiving line, where she would welcome arriving guests, escort honorees forward, and stand beside him for the duration of the ceremony. That instruction reached Isolde's office at 11:30 that morning. She read it once, called in an aide, crossed out Rosalind's name by hand, wrote her own name above it, and ordered the amended guest list sent directly to the rehearsal team. She never consulted King Edmund. She simply replaced the sovereign's written command with her own. 40 minutes before the doors were due to open, Alaric found both versions of the document sitting on a desk in the household office. Because his father had already discussed the original arrangement with him the night before, there was no ambiguity about what he was looking at. He carried the original alongside the altered copy, found Isolde in a corridor near the state apartments, and asked her, directly, to explain the discrepancy. She didn't deny making the change. Instead, she defended it as a correction of rank, insisting that Rosalind's public popularity did not entitle her to stand ahead of the Queen Consort in a formal receiving line. That single sentence told Alaric everything he needed to know. This hadn't been a clerical mistake or a misreading of handwritten notes. Isolde had knowingly used the palace's own command system to reverse a decision the king had already made. Alaric kept the confrontation brief and controlled, restored the original receiving order before the ceremony began, and said nothing further to her in the corridor. His aunt, Princess Helena, the king's sister, had overheard the exchange from behind a nearby gallery door. She took the revised page from her nephew and examined it closely. The crossed-out name, the substitution written above it, and the instruction in Isolde's own hand ordering it distributed to staff. The investiture itself proceeded that afternoon without any visible disruption, with Rosalind standing exactly where King Edmund had originally placed her. Privately, though, Helena carried both documents into the king's private study that same evening and laid them side by side across his desk. Faced with his own signature on one page and his wife's handwriting altering the other, King Edmund could no longer treat the incident as isolated. His authority, inside his own household, had been deliberately overruled. Helena requested a full review of every ceremonial directive that had passed through Isolde's office over the previous 6 weeks. By midnight, the deputy private secretary had pulled the original files, the circulated versions, delivery logs, and staff acknowledgement records. 3 separate alterations followed an identical pattern. First, a briefing prepared for Rosalind ahead of a national remembrance ceremony had sat in Isolde's office until barely 45 minutes before the event, leaving Rosalind almost no time to prepare before facing grieving military families and their representatives. Second, a youth literacy engagement that had already been formally assigned to Rosalind was quietly redirected onto Isolde's own calendar after the king had approved the original assignment. Third, the reception order for a delegation of visiting foreign dignitaries had been rearranged, placing Rosalind behind 2 extended family members whom King Edmund had specifically ranked below her. In every case, the change had been made after the document left the king's desk. None of the 3 alterations carried his initials, his revised signature, or any written record of his consent. Staff testimony gathered during the review confirmed something worse than simple overreach. A pattern of intimidation. One scheduling officer who had questioned the delay on the remembrance briefing was barred from attending further planning meetings for 10 days as a result. Another aide had quietly preserved email timestamps showing that Rosalind's own office had requested a missing file 3 separate times before it was finally released. A third staff member produced the amended reception order alongside the original version, which had been kept safely in the palace archive. Taken together, the records established not confusion, but clear intent, a consistent method, and real consequences for anyone inside the household who pushed back. After reviewing everything Helena had assembled, King Edmund closed the folder, canceled the rest of his appointments for the day, and ordered Isolde to meet him in the private library before midnight. Alaric and Helena would be present as witnesses, given that the evidence touched not only the king's personal authority, but the future functioning of the monarchy itself. At 10 the next morning, 4 folders sat waiting on the long library table, each containing an instruction the king had personally approved and that had subsequently been altered inside Isolde's office. When Isolde entered and saw her own handwriting across every one of the 4 pages, she understood immediately why she had been summoned. She took the chair opposite her husband. Alaric sat near the fireplace. Helena remained standing near the windows. Rather than dispute the handwriting, which would have been pointless, Isolde chose instead to defend the alterations as necessary protection of her own position within the household. She argued that Rosalind's expanding responsibilities, combined with Alaric's growing influence and Edmund's reduced schedule, had effectively created a second center of power inside the palace, one she believed would eventually reduce her to a purely ceremonial figure before the next reign even began. King Edmund rejected that defense outright. Whatever insecurity she felt did not grant her the authority to rewrite commands carrying his signature. For the palace to function at all, he told her, every member of staff needed to trust that an instruction leaving his desk would arrive at its destination unchanged. He then laid out 3 conditions. Isolde would acknowledge the alterations formally, restore every affected duty back to Rosalind, and surrender control of the internal channel used to distribute official schedules and briefings across the household. Compliance would keep the entire dispute contained within the family. Refusal would send everything Helena had gathered to a formal council review. Surrendering control of that channel would have ended Isolde's influence over senior staff, palace access, and the flow of information generally. Accepting the king's terms would have protected her public standing while stripping her of real power. She refused all 3 conditions anyway, and her response shifted the blame elsewhere entirely, turning toward Alaric and accusing him of exploiting his father's reduced workload to advance his wife's standing at the expense of Isolde's own household. Alaric calmly redirected the conversation back to the 4 altered documents on the table. Helena then opened the staff file, reading aloud from signed statements describing retaliation against employees who had challenged instructions coming out of Isolde's office. Faced with that evidence, Isolde warned her husband that a formal council review would permanently damage the public position he had spent years defending on her behalf. The king did not back down. By midday, Isolde left the library without apologizing and without surrendering control of the channel. Once the doors closed behind her, King Edmund authorized the formal council investigation that would ultimately decide whether she kept her title at all. 7 counselors gathered 2 days later inside the same chamber where, weeks earlier, no one had imagined this proceeding would ever take place. Laid out before them were the altered directives, communication logs, staff statements, and a full timeline tracking each document through Isolde's office from the moment it left the king's desk. Digital timestamps confirmed the sequence beyond dispute. Every instruction left King Edmund's office intact, and changes only entered the record after Isolde or a staff member acting under her written authority had accessed the file. Rosalind's household then received either an amended version, a delayed briefing, or a reassigned duty, depending on the case. Beyond the paperwork itself, the council weighed a genuine institutional failure. During the National Remembrance Ceremony, Rosalind had received the full protocol file only 45 minutes before facing assembled military officers and bereaved families, forcing her team to compress what should have been 2 hours of preparation into a fraction of that time. A single overlooked precedence note, had it gone unnoticed, would have placed a visiting foreign representative in the wrong position on live television. Alaric submitted the file record and the signed staff statements showing that objections raised by employees had directly resulted in restricted access or reassigned duties. Together, this connected Isolde's conduct not just to a family dispute, but to genuine damage inflicted on the crown's own chain of command. A sealed appendix followed the main findings. If the council approved it during a final vote, its provisions would strip Isolde of her scheduling authority, transfer her ceremonial staff, block her access to Rosalind's briefings, and reassign responsibility for precedence decisions going forward. Finally, the appendix specified that the Queen Consort title itself, along with its full duties, would pass directly to Rosalind. No one in the chamber treated this as a symbolic gesture. The title controlled real rank, real staffing, and real authority during official state functions. Leaving it with Isolde while stripping away its working powers would have created 2 competing chains of command inside the same palace, an arrangement no institution could sustain for long. After 6 hours of deliberation, the council approved a provisional recommendation to transfer both the title and its authority to Rosalind. King Edmund read the conclusion twice, removed his glasses, and rested both hands flat on the table in front of him. Allowing the recommendation to move forward would represent the strongest institutional rejection of his wife since their marriage began. Halting it, on the other hand, would leave every future command he issued exposed to the same kind of interference. Across the table, one counselor stated the choice plainly. Protecting Isolde from this level of public humiliation would mean asking Rosalind, the palace staff, and the future of the monarchy itself to absorb the resulting damage instead. Silence settled over the chamber. The council chairman then placed the provisional recommendation in front of King Edmund before formally advancing it to a binding vote. The king asked for one more night, one final attempt to secure Isolde's voluntary withdrawal before the process became irreversible. The chairman agreed, postponing the final vote until 9 the following morning. King Edmund used the remaining hours to draft a withdrawal agreement designed to preserve Isolde's dignity without restoring any of the authority she had abused. Under its terms, she would surrender the Queen Consort title voluntarily. In exchange, 6 of her patronages would remain formally under her name. 12 members of her staff would keep their positions, and she would retain a reduced ceremonial role beside the king at family occasions. The palace would describe the whole arrangement publicly as a planned transition rather than a disciplinary removal. That evening, King Edmund carried the unsigned agreement to Isolde's private apartments himself. 2 copies sat on a writing table between them. Their pages preserved her 6 patronages, her residence, and her existing security arrangements, while the final section transferred all staff briefings, precedence decisions, and official duties to Rosalind. Isolde read every provision without once turning to look at her husband. Accepting the agreement would protect her public reputation, but permanently surrender the palace machinery she had spent years quietly accumulating control over. Rejecting it would trigger the council's binding vote the next morning and erase every protection King Edmund had just negotiated on her behalf. For nearly 40 minutes, neither copy moved from the table. Before leaving the room, King Edmund set his own fountain pen down beside the signature line and said nothing further. He had defended her through years of public criticism and family tension. This agreement marked the edge of what that defense could still cover. Midnight came and went without an answer. Shortly before dawn, Isolde summoned her private secretary into the room. Rather than sign either copy, she tore both of them in half and sealed the pieces inside the council's own envelope, along with a short written note refusing the arrangement entirely. By 6:30 that morning, the envelope reached King Edmund back at the castle. He opened it alone and found the torn pages stacked beneath the still unsigned signature sheet. Her decision closed the last remaining path to a private resolution. The king informed the council chairman that negotiations had failed. Staff were instructed to prepare the chamber, retrieve the sealed appendix, and summon Isolde for the now binding vote. At 9 that morning, Isolde entered the council chamber wearing the composed, unreadable expression reserved for formal state occasions. King Edmund sat at the head of the table facing her. Alaric and Helena took seats behind the counselors as witnesses rather than voters. On the table between everyone lay the rejected agreement, the sealed appendix,